In the Slammer. 35 years inside with Noel Razor Smith.
Hello and welcome to In the Slammer, 35 years with Noel Razor Smith. My name's Elliott Frisby and this is the podcast where we talk the truth, the whole truth, and if you've been watching, you'll know the only truth. And I've got a question, as we always do to start off, Noel, and as always, I don't expect it to stay on that question for very long because we often go off in different directions.
I do ramble.
No, it's great. I mean, the content's just fantastic. But with this one, I think this is something that people are going to be really interested about. I think it's more than one podcast. And I think people are going to be interested in this because it turns up a lot in films, movies, that sort of thing, TV programs. And that's smuggling.
Right.
All right. So smuggling. So you're inside. I imagine we could be covering a lot of things here, food, drugs, bits and pieces. And so how do things get smuggled in? Can you pay someone to do things like that? Is it done on favours? Is it possible to get something through visiting hours? Smuggling.
Well, obviously, nowadays smuggling is a bit different in the prison because you've got the likes of modern technology like drones and stuff like that. In my day, the only way to really get anything into prison was either to pay a bent prison officer, of which there were, I'm sad to say, many, who would take a few quid to get you in.
What's a few quid?
Well, say if you wanted, in the 80s, if you wanted, say, a bottle of vodka, a half pint of vodka, it would cost you 50 quid, right, to a member of staff. They'd go out and buy it for 8 quid or whatever, the rest would be theirs. And you don't, contrary to, popular opinion, don't actually have to have the money in prison because the payment that you're making will be done by a member of your family outside, away from the prison. So the officer ain't going to smuggle nothing in until he's been given the money.
So what? So you'd speak to the officer, you'd speak to your family member, and say, look,
arrange for them to
meet up.
Yeah.
Right.
But obviously that was, that was, it still gets done today. People still smuggle like that today. But I'm not trying to, what I'm not trying to do is tar every prison officer with the same brush. There's a lot of them that the majority will not smuggle anything in, and they do catch a lot of them every year smuggling stuff in and they get sacked. So, it's not something that I'm just...
Do they get sacked or do they do time for it?
No, they get sacked. Sometimes they do time for it, depending on what's found. When I was in Highdown...
It's illegal, isn't it?
Yeah. I was in Highdown prison. There was a female member of staff in the 90s who used to sell ecstasy, cocaine, heroin and cannabis on the wing, and she got caught. There was a huge case over it. When they raided the house, she got actually stopped in a car with a mate of hers on a Saturday night after being night clubbing, and they found 5 grams of cocaine. So they then searched her house and found scales and various other drugs packed up ready to be smuggled into prison. And she ended up getting quite a bit of bird for it. I think she got 4 years for it. But they do sack them, and some of them do get bird, depending on... But kind of personal prisoner smuggling, it used to be the main way in. And you could only do that on visits. And you had certain ways of doing it. There was 3 main ways of doing it. Necking, which is where you take, because bear in mind, if you're smuggling heroin into a prison, I mean... that big the parcel has to be, and you could be smuggling that heroin for like 6 weeks because it's really easy it's very easy to put into a small package. And necking would be they'd wrap it up in cling film, then put it in a condom, tie it up, and then you'd get it on a visit and you'd put it down your neck while you're drinking a cup of tea on a visit or while you're eating something and swallow it to be retrieved later, usually by... A lot of the really bad junkies who really wanted the gear would go back to their cells and drink a bottle of shampoo and try and throw up the parcel before it actually got into their system. And if it did get into their system, they had to wait for it to come out in the natural way. And a lot of people you would see in the recesses actually digging through feces in order to retrieve parcels. It's a very dirty place, prison, when it comes to that. So if you've got any issues...
Would that happen in a cell? Because as I say, when we say about the overcrowding, you've got, say, 3 people in a... So that would happen right there. People would be going through the feces.
Well, I've got to tell you, I mean, we're not actually talking about the ablutions in jail, but one of the things you've got to take into account is even to this, not so much today because they've got toilets in a lot of prison cells, but up until the 90s, most prison grounds were covered in what they called unexploded bombs or ship parcels. So if you needed to use the toilet, there was no toilets in the cell. You had to go in a T-shirt or a newspaper, wrap it up and throw it out the window because you're not sitting in there for 12 hours with a parcel in the corner stinging the cell out. And that was quite common. Right. So someone raking through their own feces for a parcel, it was so common it wasn't even worthy of note. You know, I mean, you'd be sitting in the cell, someone would be searching, you'd be reading your book and you go, you found it yet? You know, it was that kind of casual.
Were there like sinks in there? I mean, all means like, he's got his hands covered in crap.
Yeah, no, there was no sinks. You got a bowl of water.
Smell after that.
Yeah. Bowl of water, you just rub your hands, but throw it out the window, wash your hands in a bowl of water. Another common way was called bottling, which is where you actually put the item into your rectum, insert it into your arse, so that when you come through a visit, they can search you down, they can run a wand over you, nothing. And when you get back, you would then squat on the floor and force the parcel out. That was the most common way of getting anything into prison.
But the officers, there weren't no officers who'd put on a pair of gloves and...
They couldn't. Legally, they can't. They're not supposed... They have done. There's been some cases in the European Court, particularly in Whitemore Prison, where they actually held prisoners down and went up their backside to try and retrieve things. Disgrace. I've had... what they used to do in Rochester, when I was there, when it was a Borstal, was... And this was... I think there's so many paedophiles in prison and so many sexual deviants amongst the staff. What they used to do in Rochester, bearing in mind...
Amongst the staff?
Yeah, bearing in mind, we're all under 21 in Rochester. You had to be under... Some of them were 14 and 15. And what they used to do, if you had a visit with your family, they would then take you into a little room, 3 members of staff, fully clothed, and one of them would put a stick-on mirror on his boot, and you had to take off all your clothes and squat on that boot so they could look up your backside. Imagine having to do that. At 16 years old, the humiliation of that. But they do it because they know that's how prisoners smuggle things in. So I mean, nowadays it's a lot different. The still staff on the take, a small minority of staff who will smuggle things in, and that's really the only way you can get sort of bulky items. If you wanted something like a mobile phone, decent mobile phone, SIM cards, anything like that, you'd get them in through the staff. It's easier. You know, you can get little tiny phones that people can bottle on visits, but, you know, people want chargers and stuff like that. So you have to, and if you want alcohol, you have to go through the staff.
So I'm thinking you just picking up on charges there. How do you charge your phone?
Well, a lot of people, what they do is just have the wire wrapped, like the basic wire, and they'll make the prongs to fit into the phone. How they do it is you can make them out of the basic stuff you've got in the cell. You've got plugs, sockets in the cell. So they'll knock up together a charger to be able to charge their phones, or they'll use a PlayStation or something like that, the insides out. I don't know the exact details of how they do it because I'm not really that technical, but I know that people do that in prison. You know, they can charge their phones. Otherwise, it's pointless having the phone, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Things like SIM cards, most people get in on visits because they're very small. You can swallow them. You can put them in the side of your mouth. Now, here's what happens. If you're a Category A prisoner, or even in a Category A prison, before you can go on a visit, you're strip searched. That's before you go on a visit. They give you sterile uniform to wear, right? So you only wear that uniform on a visit. You go out, you have your visit, you come off the visit, you stand on a box, you strip off, they make you squat, they run a metal detector over you, then you're given your other clothes. So that's their kind of security things. But in order to get into the prison, have you ever visited a prison?
Say again?
Have you ever visited a prison?
No.
You'd be amazed at the hoops you have to jump through to actually get into the prison to visit a prison.
I know people who work in prison.
Yeah.
And they say that even they have to go through quite a lot to get through there.
So you can imagine what civilians go through. They take babies.
Tell us through it. Let's talk through it.
Well, you come to the gate. You have to show your visiting order.
And where'd you get that from?
The prisoner has to send it to you from inside the prison. If you're a Category A prisoner, you cannot visit the prison until you've sat down with the police and they've done a report on you saying that you're not a criminal. If you're a criminal, you ain't getting in. So anyway, you turn up at the prison, you show your visiting order and your ID. You have to have ID. If you've got a child, say a child under 12 months who's wearing a nappy, they have to have the nappy taken off in front of the staff to make sure there's nothing in the nappy. If you've got a bottle of milk for your baby, that has to be checked to make sure it is just milk. In some prisons, you have to put your hand into a fingerprint machine And what it does is it takes a photograph of your biometric machine, takes a photograph of you so they know exactly who you are, and sends your fingerprint straight up to Scotland Yard to check if you're wanted for anything. And then what happens then is you get into, say, the main security area. It's a bit like an airport. You've got metal detectors, so you have to take off your shoes, your belt, anything metal out your pockets into a box, and that gets kept there. You go through that, you're then rubbed down by a member of staff. You have to take your shoes and socks off sometimes. If you're a woman and you've got long hair, you have to undo your hair and shake it all out. They look in your mouth. And basically you're allowed in with, I think it's £10 in pound coins, that's all, to buy food in there in the canteen.
And are they allowed to buy you food?
Yes.
Yeah, so you're allowed, so you might actually get a little meal.
Yeah, people look forward to visits because they actually get to eat stuff that you'd never see in prison. Chocolate bars and, Jaffa cakes or whatever.
But I'd have to buy them inside?
Yeah, you have to buy them from the prison canteen, which is in the visiting hall.
Yeah.
So they can see everything being done, and you would bring them to the table of the prisoner because the prisoner's not allowed to stand up and go to the canteen.
Can I just jump on this? That's right, Noel. So it suddenly just made me think, hang on, is there a way of, would people be, or was there a time when through the shop or through the kitchens that things would get smuggled in the back door?
Oh, yeah, it's been done. There was a major case in Belmarsh when it first opened. They had a privatised company serving the food and delivering the food. And one of the women who got a job on this canteen, privatised canteen, was from Woolwich and was the wife of a major drug dealer who knew nearly everyone in the prison. And it was all in the papers and everything. And what she used to do was you'd put in your order for drugs, say 3 bags of heroin, via this guy in the prison. And then when you went up to collect your meal, while they're handing you over the meal, she might give you a sandwich or a roll and your stuff would be in the roll. So it was virtually foolproof. Until she got found out. There was a huge case over it. She got the sack. Prison went under the spotlight. But it does happen. And there's people... Here's one of the other ones that became quite popular. They realised that ecstasy and cocaine can actually be drawn out, and you can put it on paper. You can make paper or cloth. You can imbibe it with the cocaine or the heroin, so that if you get, say, a couple of T-shirts sent in and someone's put heroin in them, you can then get the heroin out and soaking them and re-dry it. So there's a lot of that. And on letters and in CDs, they would seal the CDs up again and put the parcel inside. There's so many smuggling tricks going on. So what they've done now is, this is what they've done to combat all that recently, is in most prisons now where you go, if your family sends you in a letter, they send you in a birthday card, a Christmas card, a photograph, they will be photocopied and you'll be given the photocopies, and the originals will be kept in your store property till you're released. So you get nothing that comes directly in.
That happens right now.
Yeah,
so that's
the rule now.
So once you go inside, you can say goodbye to actually seeing a handwritten letter. You see a photo print, no birthday card.
No, photographs.
It's a silly question, but would they photograph the front cover of the card or just the inside writing?
Depends which prison it is and how busy they are. If you're in a prison like Wandsworth where they're doing 200 people a day, then no. All they do is they'll say you got a card, go down and we'll photocopy it for you.
So I want to bring up this bit. So you read and people moan nowadays that, people go in prison and, they're just playing table tennis all day and, they play pool and it's like a hotel and all this stuff. And you hear people say that.
Yeah.
You hear people say that. But the bottom line is, you do something wrong and you do time, it's not a pretty picture at all. You're basically cut off. Even you get a bit of visiting hours, but those personal trinkets and stuff.
The actual punishment, legally, the punishment for your crime is only a loss of liberty. That's it. The loss of liberty is what you are given at court. And the rest of it is whatever the prison adds on or whatever the government adds on in order to keep the prison safe. So your actual sentence is loss of liberty. But when you get in there, you find you've lost a lot more. As you say, you can't, sometimes what happened to me in Grendon, I was in a good, and I hadn't taken drugs for 10 years, right? I was in Grendon, had nothing to do with cannabis at all and hadn't for 10 years. And my son came up to visit me and a dog sat down on him because they have drug dogs in the prison reception. So if you walk past a dog or the dog walks past you and it sits down, that's it, you're a drug suspect. Now, what you can do then is either...
When you say sit down, it was like, let's just say the dog comes up now, sits in front of you, doesn't growl or anything like that?
Just that's an indication.
Okay.
So what would happen then was you get a choice. If they really suspect you have got drugs, then they might phone the police and get you arrested on the spot or searched on the spot. Or they will tell you, get out of the prison, you're not having a visit, the dog sat down on you, or you can have closed visits. And closed visits is behind a screen. So you have to shout, there's some little holes in the perspex glass, you're there, your visitors are there, you're sitting here, there's a prison officer standing there in this room with you, prison officer standing in the room with them, and you have to shout through these little holes so you can't touch each other, so that it's a non-contact visit.
Is that similar to, when you see these, like these televised things, where once upon a day, had like a phone on the wall sort of thing, that kind of romanticised kind of TV programme. Similar to that, but without the phone?
Yeah. In some prisons, they've got the phone, but most of them, they haven't. And there's normally only 2 to 4 spaces for closed visits because they don't expect to have more than 4 closed visits in each visiting day. That would mean catching 4 people with drugs or suspecting 4 people. And obviously, a lot of people do smuggle stuff into prisoners in this way by coming in on visits, but that's a minority of what's smuggled into prison.
What about like, so I think we've kind of mainly been talking about drugs there, haven't we? Smuggling drugs. Other things, food, weapons. Because you mentioned before about the stabbings and things like that. I suppose you can break a table and get a shard and do some damage. But did people get weapons in?
I have known it. High down prison. I remember 91, I think it was, a guy brought in a 6-inch lock knife on a visit, smuggled it in, and he became the king of the wing because people were afraid to go up against him because they knew they'd get a proper blade in the neck.
But would someone else be trying to get that blade off him?
Yeah, yes, definitely. And he would leave it to someone when he goes, so someone else would take over. They're like legacy things. Anything good in prison is left to the next generation.
How can a knife be concealed for that long?
Right. 6-inch lock knife, folded, wrapped in cling film, will go up someone's backside. When you think, right, and I don't mean to be rude here.
That's right, go on.
But you think when people actually defecate, sometimes it's that long. Yeah. And then you think about putting a 6-inch knife up your bum, it don't seem so outrageous. It's a hiding place.
So when they're not using it, they would hide it. Yeah.
Some people, what they will do is they'll smuggle it in and then find a place in the prison where they think is safe to actually hide it, or they get a mule. They'll find some div on the wing, of which there are many, who's desperate for a bit of drugs, and they go, right, hide that for me, stick it up your arse, you hold it, whenever I want it, I'll let you know. So if they get caught with it, it's down to them, but they're getting paid an amount of drugs, say, or whatever, to hold on to it. And there's a lot of that in prison.
Yeah.
There's a lot of getting people to do things for you by paying them with drugs. You can get someone killed in jail for 3 grams of heroin. That's the going price for a hit. So people are willing to do anything for drugs, really.
Desperation. And maybe a little bit of sort of escapism. So did you find that people who weren't into drugs would perhaps turn to drugs when you're inside? It's just I know it's a bit off topic, but
that's a good question, and it's something that I feel very strongly about because I was in prison through the 70s and 80s when the heroin revolution inside was going on. And before, what used to happen was, say in the 70s, most prisoners would smoke cannabis, hashish. It was cheap. You could get an ounce for 60 quid. Nobody got into debt over it because it was so cheap. And it was a calming drug. But what they done was they brought in mandatory drug testing, which meant if you had it in your system up to 28 days afterwards, you were losing a month prison sentence and getting done again. So a lot of people turned to heroin because they discovered heroin can be flushed through the body in 2 days after you've taken it. The trouble with heroin is it's expensive, it leads to violence, and when you take it, you don't want to relax. You want to be out and about scratching your face and talking nonsense to people. So you can obviously see who's on heroin. So people on heroin in jail, you can get them to do anything. If they take drugs, you give them a bit of heroin. My brother-in-law, he's still in jail now. He got paid in Whitemore. I think he got paid a gram of heroin, him and his mate, to go and stab someone, actually kill him. And they went in and they nearly killed him, ended up getting nicked and got another life sentence on top of it, just for a bit of heroin. Yeah. Didn't even know the geezer, just done it as a hit.
crossing my mind here that I'm not saying drugs is a good thing. It's not, right? No. And don't be a mug and get into it. But I'm thinking, load of inmates sitting there smoking cannabis. They're going to be pretty chilled out. They're not going to cause as much problems as if someone is on heroin. So should they have allowed to maybe keep that is a big question, isn't it?
Well,
how did they cover? I mean, obviously the smell of it. What did they do? Like little talcum powder or something like that to sort of disguise it.
Here's the interesting thing: when people were actually when cannabis was actually king of prison, when that was the main drug, if you were a heroin user, you were looked down on by the rest of the prison system. Don't trust them. This was the thinking. Don't trust them. They're addicted. All you've got to do, if you do a crime with them and the police say, we ain't giving you your heroin, they'll roll over on you. Or they'll go to the screws and tell anything about you for a bit of heroin. So don't trust them. Puff, it's just a pastime. Nobody gets addicted to that. Nobody's really interested. So whenever you were smoking it, you couldn't be, this was the thing, you couldn't be nicked in prison for smoking cannabis. There was no rule. But if you were in possession of it, if you actually had it in your hand and you got searched, you could be nicked for having an unauthorised article.
Right.
So most of the screws were chilled out about it because they knew that if you were smoking cannabis, you're not going to be up on the roof pulling the roof off. You're going to be laying in your bed eating a Mars bar, reading the Beano. So they liked it. And what they used to do was, on association, if people were smoking it and the smell come on the wing, I've lost count of the amount of times you'd get a screw come to the door and go, open the door and go, lads, listen, do us a favour, open a fucking window. You know what I mean? Smell it out on the landing. I don't want to be searching cells all night. So they kind of accepted it. But
because they knew their life was going to be a little bit easier.
Yeah, it was a chill-out drug. Nobody's going to go on a riot when they've had 3 joints, are they? So that they turned a blind eye to it. They didn't like it, but they knew it was harmless and they knew that it made their job a bit easier. Some of them didn't. When Michael Howard became Home Secretary, the POA approached him and said, we've got to do something about the cannabis problem in our prisons. So Michael Howard brought in mandatory drug testing as the Home Secretary, which meant that all those people who used to smoke a joint and cause no trouble in prison, and they get out of prison as some kind of normal people, suddenly took their first hit of heroin in jail. And I see them all through the 80s, seriously. I never touched it because the first one I see taking it, he got sick into a bucket. I went, I'm not taking anything that makes me sick. I don't want to do it. But here's how my mates went around me. Done it 15 years, might as well have a bit. It's a bird killer, it helps the time to go quicker. This is what they're telling themselves. And I used to say, well, what about the addiction? Oh, no, if I start getting addicted, I'll knock it on the head. But it's too late by then. I see some of, probably, embarrassing, some of the finest, I don't like to say this because it sounds a bit partisan, but some of the finest criminal minds of my day in the 80s all ended up as broken, wrecked junkies just through getting addicted to heroin from taking it in prison. And then
suddenly, if you're going to be into something like heroin, you're going down a slippery slope.
Oh, yes.
The first thing pops in my head, more expensive.
Oh, yeah.
Getting yourself into more debt, getting yourself more problems, becoming a debt addict, and then suddenly you might have a knife in your back because you're not paying.
Not only that, Elliott, but what happened was, if you take your first hit of heroin in jail and you get addicted, when you get out of prison, the first thing you want is heroin, right? Now, here's the thing. In the 90s, a lot of newly released heroin addicts from prison were dying, mainly on the side of the street or in McDonald's toilets or in car parks, because they got on the heroin in jail. It's weak heroin, it's diluted. So they're taking that for 3 or 4 years. When they get out, they think, oh, I'll go and get myself a bit of heroin. And suddenly that heroin they're getting is 200 times more potent than what they've been taking for 5 or 6 years. They have their first hit and it kills them.
Yeah.
It's crazy. The amount of people who die. I know people who got out and actually died. One of them on the Isle of Wight got released from the prison, waiting for the ferry, took a hit of heroin in a McDonald's, found the drug dealer there, someone put him onto him, and died in the toilet of McDonald's on the Isle of Wight before even getting to the mainland after a 10-year sentence.
Crazy. Well, do you know what? There's some great content again. Absolutely amazing. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on drugs in the system? I mean, should if cannabis chills out inmates, should it be in there now? I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Drugs isn't a good thing, but does it have its place? I mean, that cannabis has its place outside. Does it have its place inside? If you've got a question or you've got a thought, then do drop us an email at intheslammer@monkeynutuk.com. That's intheslammer@monkeynutuk.com. If you're watching on YouTube, then do subscribe. give us a thumbs up and share it with people. And leave a comment below. We can't promise to get to them all, but we'll do our very, very best. You got a question for Noel, do fire it over. You're going through something, you want a bit of advice, fire it across, and we'll bring it up in one of these podcasts, and Noel do our best. And by all means, the name that you give us is a name that we might use. So just give us a fake name. Don't give us any name at all. You can be completely anonymous. No one needs to know. Noel, great content as always. Thanks very much, mate. Cheers.
Thank you, Elliott. Nice one.
You've been listening to In the Slammer with Noel Razor Smith, hosted by Elliott Frisby, music by Andrew Stamp, produced by Chris Byland, recorded at MonkeyNut Audiobooks. For more information, visit the In the Slammer Facebook page or visit monkeynutuk.com. If you have a question or want to contact Noel Razor Smith, then please email intheslammer@monkeynutuk.com.